12 high school graduates set out on their celebratory camping trip to Crystal Lake and were never seen again. For nearly 2 decades, families searched, investigators chased leads, and the town was left with nothing but questions. Then, in 2021, a drone flight over the lake uncovered something hidden below, and what emerged would change everything. On September 15, 2021, Jake Morrison, a 34-year-old drone pilot, arrived at Crystal Lake in Washington to conduct an aerial survey of a 12-acre lakefront property. The area had once been a family resort, but was now prime real estate. His job was to capture footage to help potential buyers evaluate the land's development potential. Morrison arrived just after sunrise. The old resort buildings had been demolished, leaving only concrete foundations and a weathered dock. He unpacked his equipment from his truck, a high-end aerial drone with 4K cameras and an underwater unit for checking lake bottoms. Morrison had been flying drones professionally for 8 years and took pride in thorough work. Today's survey would include both aerial and underwater imaging to check for environmental issues or obstacles that might concern developers. The drone took off smoothly, and Morrison guided it in a systematic grid pattern over the property, capturing footage from multiple angles. The land was beautiful, with mature trees, gentle slopes, and clear lake access. After finishing the aerial survey, he began underwater imaging. The underwater camera descended beneath the lake surface, its LED lights cutting through the murky depths. Crystal Lake was deeper than many people knew, with some areas over 200 feet deep. Near the shoreline, the water was 30 to 40 feet deep. Morrison watched the live feed showing the typical underwater view of a mountain lake: fallen logs, scattered rocks, and occasional fish. About 200 yards from shore, the camera captured something that made Morrison stop. The image was partly blocked by sediment and water plants, but there appeared to be geometric shapes on the lake bottom that did not belong. He moved the drone closer and adjusted the camera angle. What came into view was hard to explain. 4 rectangular objects sat on the lake bottom, arranged in what looked like a deliberate pattern. They were clearly man-made, with straight lines and metal surfaces that stood out against the organic lake floor. Morrison first thought they might be construction debris from the resort demolition, but as he examined them closer, a more disturbing possibility formed. The objects were vehicles, 4 cars sitting upright on the lake bottom, covered in nearly 2 decades of sediment and algae growth. Morrison could make out windshields, door frames, and license plates, though the text was not readable through the murky water. What struck Morrison as most disturbing was their arrangement. They were not scattered randomly like accidental submersion would cause. Instead, they were positioned in a rough semicircle, with their front ends facing inward toward a central point. It looked intentional and organized. Morrison's hands shook as he moved the drone for a closer look. This discovery felt different. These were not just abandoned vehicles. The deliberate arrangement, remote location, and the fact that they had remained hidden for many years pointed to carefully planned concealment. As the full scope of his discovery became clear, Morrison realized he was no longer doing a routine real estate survey. He had found what appeared to be a crime scene hidden beneath Crystal Lake for years. He carefully packed his equipment and secured all footage. By late morning, Morrison called the Cascade County Sheriff's Department and reported finding multiple submerged vehicles in Crystal Lake. The response to Morrison's call was swift. By 2 p.m. on September 15, 2021, Crystal Lake had transformed from a quiet real estate site into the center of what would become one of Washington State's biggest cold case breakthroughs. Detective Marcus Webb, 58 and months from retirement, stood on the old dock, watching dive teams prepare their equipment. He had been the lead investigator on a case that started in this same area 19 years earlier. Webb's mind went back to May 2002. He had been a young detective then, confident he could solve any case. The disappearance of 12 recent high school graduates had challenged that confidence in ways he never expected. Now, as sonar equipment showed detailed images of the sunken vehicles, Webb felt the familiar weight of unfinished business. The story had started in 2002 when 12 members of Riverside High School's graduating class went on what should have been a fun weekend camping trip. For over 2 decades, graduating seniors had organized unsupervised trips to Crystal Lake Resort, a small family-owned place that welcomed young people seeking a final adventure before adulthood. The class of 2002 was particularly close. Riverside High School served a rural community of fewer than 3,000 people. The graduating class had grown up together, sharing classrooms, sports teams, and social circles since elementary school. Of the 25 graduates, 12 had organized the Crystal Lake trip. They were Sarah Chen, Michael Torres, Jessica Walsh, David Kim, Amanda Foster, Ryan Mitchell, Stephanie Liu, Brandon Cole, Nicole Harper, Tyler Brooks, Samantha Reed, and Alex Martinez. The remaining 13 classmates had different reasons for not going. Some had family duties, others had already started summer jobs, and a few simply were not interested in camping. There was no bad feelings or division within the class. It was simply a matter of different interests and situations. Those who stayed behind would later say they felt no particular worry about missing the trip. It was meant to be a casual, fun weekend among friends. On the morning of May 25, 2002, the 12 friends met in the Riverside High School parking lot for a final group photo before leaving. The image, later shared widely during the search efforts, captured a moment of pure joy and excitement. The students were dressed casually in hiking clothes and camping gear. Their faces were bright with excitement about their upcoming adventure. 4 cars would make the journey. Sarah Chen's parents had allowed her to borrow their Honda Accord. Michael Torres drove his own Ford Explorer. Jessica Walsh had her family's Subaru Outback. David Kim was behind the wheel of his older brother's Chevrolet Tahoe. The group left Riverside at about 10:30 a.m., following a route that would take them through winding mountain roads to Crystal Lake Resort, located about 90 miles northeast of their hometown. The drive was scenic, passing through dense forests and alongside rushing streams filled with spring snowmelt. Cell phone coverage in the area was poor at best. This fact did not concern the students or their parents. The lack of connectivity was part of the appeal of getting away from civilization for a few days. Crystal Lake Resort in 2002 was a small operation run by Thomas Blackwood, a local businessman who had owned the property for nearly 15 years. The resort had a main lodge, several basic cabins, a small marina, and camping areas scattered throughout the forested property. It was not luxurious, but it offered exactly what young people wanted: privacy, natural beauty, and minimal adult supervision. Blackwood had built a reputation for being helpful to student groups, understanding that these trips were important coming-of-age experiences for rural communities. The plan was simple: arrive Friday afternoon, set up camp, spend Saturday hiking and enjoying the lake, and return home Sunday evening, May 28th. Parents expected their children home by 6 p.m. on Sunday, allowing time for unpacking and preparation for the work week ahead. It was a reasonable timeline for a trip that had been successfully completed by dozens of previous graduating classes. Sunday evening came and went without any sign of the 12 students. At first, parents were not too concerned. Young people often lost track of time, and the lack of cell phone coverage meant communication was impossible. By 8 p.m., however, concern began to grow. Linda Chen, Sarah's mother, was the first to voice her worry, calling other parents to confirm that none of their children had returned. Monday morning brought growing panic. Linda Chen contacted Crystal Lake Resort directly, speaking with Thomas Blackwood himself. His response was puzzling and alarming. Blackwood told her that no one from Riverside High had checked in, and he had no memory of seeing them that weekend. The resort had been busy with other guests, he explained, but he was certain the Riverside group had never arrived. By Monday afternoon, a full-scale search operation was underway. The Cascade County Sheriff's Department worked with state police and volunteer search teams to locate the missing students. Search teams checked every possible route between Riverside and Crystal Lake, looking at rest stops, gas stations, and scenic overlooks where the students might have stopped. They found nothing. No trace of the 4 vehicles, no witnesses who remembered seeing the group of young people. For 3 weeks, the search continued with increasing desperation. State police helicopters equipped with thermal imaging were brought in, sweeping grid patterns over the dense forest surrounding every possible route to Crystal Lake. Dog units were used along mountain roads, hoping to pick up any scent trail. Volunteer searchers, including many of the 13 surviving classmates, searched through remote areas where the vehicles might have gone off-road or been hidden. The effort was massive, involving hundreds of people and representing one of the largest search operations in the region's history. As days turned into weeks with no discoveries, theories began to emerge. Some suggested the students had encountered a tragic accident in a remote location where they had not yet been found. Others proposed more sinister possibilities: abduction by human traffickers, involvement with drug dealers, or even voluntary disappearance as part of some elaborate plan. The complete lack of any physical evidence made every theory seem equally possible and equally frustrating. Local news outlets covered the disappearance of the Riverside graduates, but the lack of concrete details made it difficult to sustain public interest. Without crime scene photos, abandoned vehicles, or witness statements, there was little for reporters to follow up on. The case officially went cold after 6 months of intensive investigation. The years following the disappearance settled into a pattern of quiet desperation and fading hope. For most of the community, life slowly returned to normal. But for the families of the missing students, time had stopped on May 28, 2002, the day their children failed to come home. Linda Chen had turned her grief into an obsession that consumed nearly 2 decades. Sarah's bedroom remained exactly as it had been left that Friday morning in May 2002. Her graduation cap hung on the closet door, acceptance letter to the University of Washington pinned to the bulletin board. Linda had first kept the room as a place of hope, believing her daughter would return. As years passed, it became a monument to unanswered questions. The other 11 families had chosen different paths through their grief. Her investigation began modestly in 2003, a year after the official search had been stopped. Linda started by going over every step of the original investigation, requesting copies of police reports, witness statements, and search records. She created a detailed timeline of the days leading up to the disappearance, interviewing classmates, teachers, and family members about any unusual behavior or conversations they might have remembered. Her dining room table became command central, covered with maps, photographs, and carefully organized files. Marcus Webb, the detective who had led the original investigation, found himself haunted by the case in ways that affected his entire career. He had worked hundreds of cases over the years: murders, robberies, assaults. But none had left him feeling as professionally inadequate as the disappearance of the 12 graduates. The complete absence of evidence had been unlike anything in his experience, and he had never stopped wondering what he might have missed. Webb had unofficially continued investigating the case long after it had been moved to the cold case files. He maintained contact with Linda Chen, occasionally following up on tips or new leads that emerged. He had traveled to other states to investigate possible sightings, spent his own money on database searches and background checks, and consulted with experts in missing persons cases. Nothing had ever yielded results, but he could not bring himself to completely abandon the investigation. By 2010, 8 years after the disappearance, Linda had tried most normal ways to find answers. She hired a private investigator, but found nothing new. She checked out reported sightings that all turned out to be wrong people. She joined an online group for families of missing persons and shared Sarah's story. At first, she hoped this might bring new information, but most discussions turned into guessing games instead of real help. As Linda entered her 60s, friends and family worried about the toll her obsession was taking. She had never remarried after her divorce in 2005, a result of the strain the investigation had placed on her marriage. She had retired early to devote more time to the search for answers. The surviving classmates, now in their 30s, had built lives their missing friends would never experience. They had married, started families, and established careers. Reunions were bittersweet affairs, marked by empty chairs and unspoken questions. Some had children of their own now, giving them new perspective on what the families had endured. Detective Webb, approaching retirement in 2021, had never stopped carrying the weight of the unsolved case. The case files filled 3 large boxes in the cold case storage room. Webb visited them regularly, reviewing witness statements and photographs, hoping fresh eyes might spot something that had been missed. But after 19 years, the files held no secrets. Every lead had been exhausted, every theory explored. Crystal Lake Resort had changed hands twice since 2002, and new owners tried to distance the property from its association with the disappearance. The resort was renovated and rebranded, marketed to families rather than young people. But locals still remembered, and the story of the vanished graduates remained part of the area's dark folklore. Webb had no way of knowing that the answers he had sought for nearly 2 decades lay just 40 feet beneath the surface of the very lake where it all began. The underwater recovery operation at Crystal Lake began at dawn on September 16, 2021, just 24 hours after Morrison's discovery. Detective Webb stood on the makeshift command platform built on the old resort dock, watching dive teams prepare to raise the first vehicle. Linda Chen's memorial service was scheduled for the following weekend, and for the first time in 19 years, he might actually have answers to offer the grieving families. The first vehicle to be recovered was the Honda Accord that Sarah Chen had borrowed from her parents on that May morning in 2002. As the crane slowly lifted the sedan from the lake bottom, water poured from its windows and doors, carrying with it nearly 2 decades of sediment and water debris. The car's silver paint was barely visible beneath layers of algae and rust, but the license plate was still readable. Washington state plates that matched the registration records from the original investigation. Webb felt his pulse quicken as the vehicle was lowered onto a flatbed trailer. This was the first real evidence in a case defined by its complete absence of clues. The car's windows were intact, but cloudy with grime, making it impossible to see inside. As crime scene technicians began documenting and photographing the vehicle, Webb noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The car had been deliberately weighted down with concrete blocks still attached to its undercarriage. The recovery of the remaining 3 vehicles proceeded methodically throughout the morning. Each vehicle showed the same deliberate preparation for submersion: concrete weights, sealed windows, and careful positioning on the lake bottom. This was not an accident or panic disposal. It was a calculated operation designed to hide evidence permanently. As the vehicles were transported to a secure facility for detailed forensic examination, Webb coordinated with the medical examiner's office and FBI forensic specialists. The discovery had elevated the case from a local missing persons investigation to a potential federal crime scene, given the evidence of organized criminal activity and the possibility of multiple homicides. The first breakthrough came during the examination of Sarah Chen's Honda Accord. Crime scene technicians, working in a sterile garage facility, carefully drained the remaining water from the vehicle and began the painstaking process of cataloging its contents. The car's interior was remarkably well preserved, protected by the sealed environment and cold lake water. Personal belongings were still visible: a graduation cap on the back seat, camping gear in the trunk, and Sarah's purse wedged between the front seats. But it was the discovery in the trunk that changed everything. Among the personal belongings, technicians found a small bag that had stayed sealed tight. Inside was a disposable waterproof camera, still in its plastic case. Against the odds, the film had survived nearly 2 decades underwater. When the images were developed, investigators were stunned. What looked like normal trip snapshots actually showed the inside of the resort's outbuildings. In the background of several photos were tables covered in plastic bags, scales, and stacks of bundled cash, evidence of drug packaging and distribution. Investigators concluded that the students had reached the resort and stumbled onto something they were never meant to see. They had accidentally documented a drug operation, likely without realizing the danger it placed them in. For Webb, the conclusion was clear. The 12 students were murdered because they had witnessed criminal activity that threatened powerful people. The investigation into Thomas Blackwood revealed a complex web of criminal activity that extended far beyond the Crystal Lake Resort operation. Financial records obtained from banks showed suspicious cash deposits and transfers dating back to the late 1990s. Property records indicated Blackwood owned several other businesses and real estate holdings that could have been used to launder drug money. But Blackwood himself had died in 2018, taking his secrets to the grave. His death had been attributed to natural causes, a heart attack at age 72. But Webb now wondered if it had been convenient timing for others involved in the conspiracy. Dead men tell no tales, and Blackwood's death had eliminated the person most likely to have direct knowledge of what happened to the 12 students. The investigation expanded to include Blackwood's known associates and employees from 2002. Many had scattered over the intervening years, but Webb and his team began the process of tracking down anyone who might have been involved in the resort's operations during the critical time period. They were looking for someone who was still alive, still in the area, and still desperate enough to threaten Linda Chen to keep the truth hidden. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus Vega, who had worked as a maintenance supervisor at Crystal Lake Resort in 2002, contacted the sheriff's department through his attorney. Now 54 years old and facing his own legal troubles related to a recent drug arrest, Vega indicated he had information about the missing students and was willing to cooperate in exchange for consideration in his current case. Vega's attorney arranged a meeting at the prosecutor's office where the former resort employee would finally reveal the truth about what had happened to the class of 2002. As Webb prepared for the interview that would close the longest-running case of his career, he thought about Linda Chen and the 19 years she had spent searching for answers. Soon, her vigil would finally be over. Marcus Vega sat hunched in his chair in the sterile interview room, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. The weight of 19 years of silence showed in the lines of his face. Detective Webb sat across from him with FBI agents and prosecutors, finally about to hear the truth that had eluded him for nearly 2 decades. Vega's attorney had negotiated a plea agreement in exchange for his client's full cooperation. The former resort maintenance supervisor faced significant prison time for recent drug charges, but his information about the class of 2002 murders would determine whether he spent the rest of his life behind bars or had a chance at freedom. Vega began. He said he never wanted anyone to get hurt, but Blackwood told them they had no choice. It was them or us. Vega's confession revealed the details of what had happened 19 years earlier. According to Vega, the 12 Riverside High School graduates had arrived at the resort on May 25, 2002, as planned. They checked into their reserved cabins and spent the evening celebrating their graduation. The tragedy began the following morning when Sarah Chen had gotten up early to take photographs of the sunrise over the lake. Her wandering had taken her near the resort's main storage building, where she had accidentally witnessed the drug operation in full swing. Vega and several other employees were packaging large quantities of methamphetamine and cocaine for distribution, while Thomas Blackwood supervised the operation and counted stacks of cash. Sarah had tried to retreat unnoticed, but Blackwood had spotted her through the building's window. Panicked by the discovery, he had ordered Vega and 2 other employees to detain Sarah and bring her to the storage building. When her friends came looking for her an hour later, they too were captured and held at gunpoint while Blackwood decided what to do. Vega recalled that Blackwood was furious. His voice shook as he described how Blackwood kept saying these kids could destroy everything, that they would all go to prison for life if they talked. He was pacing around, screaming about how much money was at stake, how many people would come after them if the operation got shut down. The students had been held captive in the storage building throughout Saturday, May 26th, while Blackwood contacted his criminal associates and debated their fate. The 12 graduates had been terrified but defiant, with several of them, including Michael Torres and David Kim, attempting to negotiate their release by promising to remain silent about what they had seen. Blackwood had been involved in illegal activity for years, and he knew that witnesses could threaten everything he had built. The resort was more than just a weekend getaway. It was a place where cash and drugs moved through. The risk of exposure was too great for him to ignore. The decision to murder the students was made on Sunday morning, May 27th. Blackwood had received instructions from his criminal superiors that the situation needed to be permanently resolved. Vega described how Blackwood had recruited additional help from criminal associates, bringing in experienced killers who specialized in making problems disappear. The murders took place that evening in the storage building where the students had been held. Vega's voice broke as he described the systematic execution of 12 young people who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The killers had used silenced weapons to avoid attracting attention, and the bodies had been wrapped in plastic sheeting and loaded into a refrigerated truck. Vega insisted he did not pull any triggers, but admitted he helped move the bodies and clean up. He was there when they loaded them into the truck. The disposal of the bodies had been carefully planned to ensure they would never be found. The refrigerated truck transported the remains to an abandoned copper mine 60 miles northeast of Crystal Lake. The bodies were dumped into a shaft that descended over 200 feet, then covered with tons of rock and debris. The vehicles had been handled separately as part of an elaborate deception meant to mislead investigators. They were driven to Crystal Lake under cover of darkness, weighted with concrete blocks, and sealed to ensure they would sink quickly and stay hidden. Blackwood believed that if the cars were ever discovered, authorities would assume the students had drowned in a tragic accident. He never anticipated anyone examining the evidence closely enough to see otherwise. The most significant breakthrough came from Sarah Chen's car. In the trunk, investigators had recovered a waterproof disposable camera. Once developed, the images placed the students at the resort and revealed glimpses of drug activity inside the outbuildings. It was accidental evidence, overlooked by those who staged the deception, and it became the key that finally unlocked the rest of the investigation. As Vega's confession continued, Webb felt both satisfaction and disgust. The case that had defined his career was finally being solved, but the truth was worse than he had imagined. 12 young people had been murdered, and their families left to suffer decades of uncertainty. The information from Vega led to immediate action. A coordinated team of FBI agents, state police, and sheriff's deputies was assembled to locate and recover the remains from the abandoned mine shaft. The operation required specialized equipment as the mine was unstable after decades of neglect. The recovery effort took 3 days of careful excavation. When the remains were brought to the surface, forensic anthropologists confirmed what everyone knew. They had found the 12 missing members of the class of 2002. The bodies were severely decomposed after 19 years, but dental records and DNA analysis provided positive identification for all 12 victims. The news sent shockwaves through the community of Riverside and beyond. Linda Chen, who had spent 19 years searching for her daughter, finally had closure, though it came with learning that Sarah had been murdered. The surviving members of the class of 2002, now adults with families, gathered for a memorial service. They had carried survivors' guilt for nearly 2 decades, wondering if they could have prevented the tragedy. Now they understood that their decision to stay home had likely saved their lives. Thomas Blackwood's death in 2018 had prevented him from facing justice, but the investigation continued. Several of his associates were arrested and charged with conspiracy and racketeering. Marcus Vega was sentenced to 25 years in prison after pleading guilty to 12 counts of accessory to murder. Detective Webb retired 6 months after the case was closed, finally able to end his career having solved the investigation that had haunted him. The Crystal Lake property was eventually sold to a conservation group that converted it into a nature preserve dedicated to the memory of the 12 victims. Linda Chen established a foundation in Sarah's name to assist families of missing persons. She had spent 19 years searching for answers and now dedicated her remaining years to helping others who faced similar tragedies. On a warm September morning in 2022, exactly 20 years after the class of 2002 had departed for their graduation trip, a permanent memorial was unveiled at Riverside High School. 12 granite stones, each bearing the name and photograph of a victim, were arranged in a circle in the school's memorial garden. The inscription at the center read simply, "In memory of 12 friends who tried to do the right thing."